They thought her voice made her small, but in less than 5 minutes, that same voice would unravel everything they believed was true, and the worst part was they would hear it too late to take it back, because the moment Angela Brooks opened her mouth, the room decided who she was, not by her words but by how they sounded, rough around the edges, shaped by long days on city sidewalks and early mornings calling out prices to passing strangers, and in a courtroom built on polished wood, tailored suits, and measured tones. That kind of voice didn't just stand out, it was quietly dismissed before it even finished a sentence, and the prosecutor noticed it immediately, the slight pause, the flicker of amusement, the subtle lean toward the jury as if sharing a private joke. "Could you repeat that for the court?" he asked, not because he didn't hear her, but because he wanted everyone else to, and when Angela repeated herself, slower this time, the faint chuckle that followed wasn't loud. But it was enough to shift the air, enough to signal that she had already lost something she hadn't even been given yet, credibility, and across the room, a woman in the gallery exchanged a glance with the man beside her, eyebrows raised, lips pressed in that familiar expression people wear when they've already made up their minds, and Angela felt it, not as anger, not even as embarrassment, but as something colder, something quieter, the recognition that she had been placed in a role she didn't choose, and no one in that room expected her to step out of it, because to them, she was just a street vendor, someone who sold bottled water and fruit cups from a folding cart on the corner of 8th and Maple, someone whose world was measured in cash bills and passing footsteps, not legal arguments or precise language, and the judge, seated high above it all, adjusted his glasses and glanced down with the same detached efficiency he used for every case, already scanning the paperwork, already preparing to move forward, because everything about Angela Brooks suggested simplicity, and simplicity, in a place like this, was often mistaken for weakness, and as the prosecutor continued, carefully choosing words that sounded professional but landed like quiet dismissals, Angela stood there in her worn sneakers, her hands still, her posture steady, her eyes not on the people watching her but somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond the surface of the moment, because while the room was busy measuring her voice, no one noticed what she was holding, a small, scuffed phone tucked into her palm, its screen dark, its presence almost invisible, the kind of object that doesn't draw attention until it does. And as the minutes ticked closer to a decision that seemed all but certain, Angela didn't interrupt, didn't defend, didn't try to match their tone or their pace, she simply waited, and in that waiting, something shifted, subtle at first, like the quiet before a storm no one sees coming, because what they heard in her voice was only half the story, and what they failed to hear would be the thing that changed everything. The prosecutor did not rush, because men like him never needed to. His confidence stretched across the room like a well-rehearsed performance, every word placed with intention, every pause calculated, and as he paced slowly in front of the jury, he began to shape a story that felt clean, simple, and easy to accept, the kind of story people nod along to without questioning too deeply, because it matched what they already believed, that someone like Angela Brooks could easily be misunderstood, could easily be in the wrong place at the wrong time, could easily say the wrong thing in the wrong way. And as he spoke, he did not attack her directly, not in any obvious way, instead he let small details do the work for him, mentioning her occupation, her location on that street corner, the way she described events in her earlier statement, and each time he repeated her words, he mimicked the tone just slightly, not enough to be called out, but enough to draw another ripple of quiet amusement from the room, and Angela stood there listening, her expression unchanged, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, because she had heard this kind of tone before, not in courtrooms, but in everyday moments, in the way people asked questions they already thought they knew the answer to, in the way they smiled without warmth, in the way they decided who you were before you even had the chance to explain yourself. And across the aisle, her public defender flipped through a thin folder, hesitating, unsure whether to interrupt, because the case itself seemed small on paper, something that should have been resolved quickly, something that did not appear to require much resistance. And that hesitation hung in the air like a missed opportunity. Because while everyone else focused on the surface, Angela was focused on something else entirely, something that had happened just hours before she ever stepped into this building, something she had replayed in her mind over and over again, not with panic, but with precision, recalling exact words, exact timing, exact tone, because details mattered, even when no one else thought they did. And as the prosecutor approached the final stretch of his argument, he turned slightly toward the judge. His voice lowering just enough to signal importance. "Your Honor, the facts are clear," he said, and the phrase landed with a sense of finality, as if the outcome had already been written, and the judge gave a small nod, glancing once more at the paperwork in front of him, preparing to move forward, because nothing about this case had disrupted the expected rhythm of the room, nothing had challenged the assumptions already in place. And yet, just a few feet away, Angela's fingers shifted slightly around the edge of that old phone, her thumb brushing against the screen without turning it on, a small movement, almost invisible, but deliberate, and in that quiet moment, something inside her settled, not fear, not doubt, but clarity, because she understood something that no one else in that room did, that the version of events they were building did not just leave out the truth, it completely ignored it. And as the judge straightened in his seat, ready to speak, Angela lifted her gaze for the first time, not to challenge, not to plead, but to meet the moment with a calm that did not belong to someone who had already lost, and in that stillness, just before the next word could fall, the balance of the room began to shift in a way no one had yet realized. The judge's fingers hovered just above the gavel, the faint reflection of the overhead lights glinting off its polished surface as the room leaned into that familiar moment where everything was about to be decided, and for most people present, the outcome already felt inevitable, just another case moving along its expected path, another voice dismissed because it did not fit the tone of authority. But Angela Brooks did not move the way someone defeated would move, she did not shift her weight or glance toward the exit or look down in quiet resignation. Instead she remained still, her gaze steady, her posture composed in a way that felt almost out of place against the subtle tension filling the room, and it was that stillness that caused the first ripple of unease, barely noticeable, like a change in air pressure before a storm, because confidence without permission always unsettles those who believe they control the outcome. And the prosecutor noticed it too, his expression tightening just slightly as if trying to understand why she had not reacted the way she was expected to, and in that fraction of a second, Angela spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, "Your Honor, may I clarify something before you proceed," and the request hung in the air longer than it should have, because it was not defiant, it was not emotional, it was precise. And precision in a moment like this demanded attention. The judge paused, just enough to acknowledge it, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered whether to allow it, because granting her another moment meant disrupting the flow, meant stepping outside the neat structure that had already been built around this case, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, the room suspended between decision and interruption, and then, with a small, measured nod, the judge allowed it, not out of belief, but out of routine fairness, the kind that often comes too late to change anything, and Angela stepped forward. Just enough to be heard without raising her voice, her words unfolding carefully, not rushed, not defensive, but deliberate. Earlier, the statement that was repeated, she said, her eyes not on the prosecutor, not on the jury, but fixed somewhere steady, it was taken out of sequence, and a faint shift moved through the gallery, confusion more than interest, because people expect emotion, they expect urgency, but they do not expect calm correction, and the prosecutor let out a soft breath that almost resembled a laugh, a quiet dismissal wrapped in professionalism. "Your Honor, we have already established the relevance of that statement," he replied, his tone smooth, controlled, as if guiding the room back to where it belonged. But Angela did not retreat, she did not match his tone, she simply continued. "It was recorded," she said, and that single word landed differently, not because of how loud it was, but because of what it implied, and for the first time, the rhythm of the room broke, just slightly, just enough for attention to shift, and the judge's hand lowered from the gavel, not fully, but enough to pause the inevitable. "Recorded," he repeated, slower this time, as if testing the weight of the word, and Angela nodded once, her fingers finally lifting the small phone from her palm, the screen still dark, the device still unremarkable, but now, suddenly, it was the only thing anyone could see, and in that moment, the confidence that had filled the room began to thin, not disappear, but weaken, because certainty relies on control, and control depends on knowing everything that matters, and for the first time since Angela Brooks had stepped into that courtroom, it became clear that something had been overlooked. The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, recorded, simple and unassuming, yet heavy enough to interrupt the certainty that had filled the room just seconds before, and the judge leaned back slightly in his chair, not fully retreating, but enough to create space between himself and the decision he had been ready to make, while the prosecutor's expression shifted, just a fraction. The confidence still there but now edged with something tighter, something more controlled, as if recalculating. Your Honor, he began, his tone measured, careful not to appear unsettled, we have not been presented with any admissible evidence of that nature, and his words were precise, chosen to restore order, to re-establish the structure that had been slipping, but Angela did not respond to him, she did not engage in the exchange he expected, instead she looked only at the judge, her voice steady. It is the full conversation, from beginning to end, she said, and the clarity of that statement did not demand attention. It commanded it, because it suggested something the room had not considered, that what they had been given was not incomplete by accident, but by design, and a quiet shift moved through the gallery, no longer amusement, no longer dismissal, but curiosity, the kind that leans forward rather than pulls away, and the judge extended his hand slightly, not yet taking the phone, but acknowledging its presence. Miss Brooks, he said, slower now, more deliberate. Are you stating that this device contains the original recording referenced in testimony? And Angela nodded once, not dramatically, not defensively, just a simple confirmation that carried more weight than any raised voice could, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable, because silence in a courtroom is rarely empty, it is filled with implication, with possibility, with the quiet realization that something may not be as settled as it seemed. And the prosecutor stepped forward again, this time quicker, his composure still intact but his pace slightly altered. Your Honor, we cannot verify the authenticity of any such recording at this stage, he said, and there it was, the first sign of resistance that did not sound like certainty, but like caution, and Angela finally moved, just one step, extending the phone toward the bench, her hand steady, her grip relaxed, as if she had nothing to protect and nothing to prove beyond what was already there. And the device, worn and ordinary, became the focal point of the entire room, a small object holding the power to disrupt everything that had been carefully constructed, and the judge hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because accepting that phone meant acknowledging that the narrative might shift, and once a narrative shifts, control follows, and control in a room like this is everything, and yet, slowly, deliberately, he reached forward and took it, the motion quiet but unmistakable, and as his fingers closed around the device, the room seemed to hold its breath, because whatever came next would not just be heard, it would be understood in a way that could not be undone. And Angela stepped back into place, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm, not watching the reaction, not anticipating the outcome, simply waiting, because she knew something that no one else in that room fully grasped yet, that truth does not need volume to be heard, it only needs the right moment to be revealed, and that moment had just arrived. The judge did not press play immediately, and that hesitation spoke louder than any objection that had been raised, because in a room where decisions were usually made with practiced efficiency, delay meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant that control was beginning to slip, even if only by an inch, and the prosecutor felt it, the subtle shift in attention. The way the jury no longer looked at him but at the small device resting in the judge's hand, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he was no longer guiding the narrative, he was reacting to it. Your Honor, he said again, this time more firmly, stepping forward just enough to reclaim space, we must consider the integrity of the process, and the words were correct, professionally delivered, but they lacked the quiet authority they carried just minutes ago, because now they sounded less like structure and more like resistance. And the judge raised a hand, not sharply, not dismissively, but enough to signal that the room would proceed on his terms, not anyone else's, and in that small gesture, the balance shifted again, because authority had moved away from assumption and toward verification, and Angela remained exactly where she was, her hands now empty, her posture unchanged, as if the outcome no longer depended on her voice at all, and that was the part no one could quite understand, because people who are desperate tend to speak, to argue, to push, but Angela did none of those things, she simply waited, and the waiting itself became its own kind of presence, steady and unshaken, and finally, the judge lowered his gaze to the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen for a brief moment before activating it, the faint glow illuminating his face just enough to draw every eye in the room toward that single point, and then, with a small, deliberate motion, he pressed play. And the first sound that filled the courtroom was not dramatic. Not loud, but unmistakably clear, the low murmur of conversation, ambient noise from a street corner, a passing car, a distant voice, ordinary details that grounded the recording in reality, and then came the voices, one of them Angela's, steady, direct, speaking in the same tone that had been mocked just moments before, but now, without interruption, without distortion, it carried differently, it held its place. It told a sequence of events that unfolded logically, consistently, without hesitation, and then, overlapping her words, another voice entered, sharper, more familiar, a voice that caused a subtle reaction across the room, heads turning slightly, brows tightening, recognition forming before anyone acknowledged it, and the prosecutor's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough, his jaw setting just slightly, his shoulders still but no longer relaxed, because the voice on that recording did not align with the version of events he had so carefully presented. It introduced timing that had not been mentioned, context that had not been explained, and tone that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding, and the longer the recording played, the quieter the room became, not the kind of quiet that comes from disinterest, but the kind that comes from realization, from the slow, undeniable awareness that something important had been left out. And the judge did not interrupt, did not pause, he let it play, every second of it, because stopping it too soon would mean returning to assumption, and that was no longer an option. And when the recording reached the moment that had been repeated earlier in court, the statement that had been used to define Angela's credibility, it did not stand alone this time, it was surrounded by context, framed by what came before and what followed, and in that framing, its meaning shifted entirely, not slightly, not debatably, but completely, and the silence that followed when the audio stopped was not empty, it was heavy, filled with everything that had just been heard and everything that could no longer be ignored. And for the first time since Angela Brooks had stepped into that courtroom, no one was looking at her voice as a weakness, they were looking at it as evidence. The silence did not break immediately, it settled, deep and unmoving, pressing into every corner of the courtroom as the weight of the recording lingered in the air, and the judge remained still, the phone resting in his hand as if it carried more than just sound, as if it carried consequence, and across the room, the prosecutor no longer stepped forward, no longer filled the space with confident explanation, because there was nothing to guide now, nothing to reshape without confronting what had just been heard, and the jury exchanged small, uncertain glances, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to reveal that something had shifted beneath the surface, because once doubt enters, it does not leave quietly, it spreads, it reshapes everything it touches, and Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but now the room looked at her differently, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had not needed to, and that difference, subtle as it was, carried more power than anything said before, and the judge finally placed the phone down on the bench, carefully, deliberately, as if marking the end of one version of the story and the beginning of another. "Counsel," he said, his voice slower now, more measured, "the context of this statement appears incomplete in the presentation provided earlier," and he did not raise his tone, did not accuse. But the implication was clear, and implication in a courtroom carries its own weight, because it forces those involved to respond, not just react, and the prosecutor straightened, adjusting his stance. Attempting to reclaim control, "Your Honor, the interpretation of audio evidence can be subjective," he replied, but even as he spoke, the certainty that once framed his words had faded, replaced by something more cautious, more defensive, and the judge did not interrupt, he allowed the words to finish, but when he responded, the balance of the room shifted again. "Subjective interpretation does not negate sequence," he said, and the distinction landed cleanly, because sequence is not opinion. It is structure, it is truth arranged in order, and once that order is revealed, it cannot be easily dismissed, and a quiet murmur moved through the gallery, quickly silenced but not unnoticed, because the audience, once disengaged, was now fully present, watching not a routine case, but a moment where perception was being corrected in real time, and Angela's public defender, who had remained uncertain until now, slowly closed the thin folder in front of him, his posture changing, not dramatically, but enough to signal that he no longer saw this as a lost situation, because the presence of evidence changes everything, even when it arrives late, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving from the prosecutor to Angela and back again, recalibrating, reassessing, because authority is not just about making decisions, it is about making the right ones when new information appears. And for the first time since the hearing began, the next words were not predictable, not routine. "We will pause before proceeding further," he said, and the gavel tapped once, not to conclude, but to interrupt the momentum that had been building toward a decision, and that single tap carried a different meaning now, not finality, but reconsideration, and as the room shifted, as people adjusted in their seats and exchanged quiet looks, Angela did not move, did not speak. She simply remained present in a moment that no longer belonged to those who had judged her too quickly, because what had changed was not just the direction of the case, but the understanding of who she was within it, and in that quiet, undeniable shift, the truth had already begun to take its place. The pause did not feel like a break, it felt like a shift in gravity, subtle but undeniable, as if the entire room had been leaning in one direction and was now slowly correcting itself, and people who had been certain just minutes ago were now quiet, not out of respect, but because certainty had been replaced by something less comfortable, something that required reconsideration. And the prosecutor stood still for a moment longer than expected, his hands resting at his sides, his posture composed but no longer commanding, because the rhythm he had controlled was gone, replaced by a slower, heavier tempo that he could not easily accelerate, and across the aisle, Angela's public defender leaned slightly closer to her, his voice low, almost careful. "Why did you not mention the recording earlier?" he asked, not accusing, but genuinely uncertain, and Angela turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her voice calm. "Because no one asked the right question," she said, and that answer, simple as it was, carried more weight than a long explanation, because it revealed something deeper than strategy, it revealed awareness, and awareness is not something easily dismissed, and the defender sat back slightly, processing that, his earlier hesitation now replaced with a quiet recognition that he had underestimated not just the case, but the person standing beside him, and at the bench. The judge reviewed the notes in front of him again, but this time the papers did not guide him, they followed him, because what had been written before no longer held the same authority, and he understood that proceeding without addressing the new evidence would not just be incomplete, it would be incorrect, and correctness in a courtroom is not optional, it is the foundation everything rests on, and the prosecutor cleared his throat softly, stepping forward once more, but this time his words came with measured restraint. "Your Honor, if the court intends to consider this material, the prosecution requests time to review its authenticity and context," and the request was reasonable, expected even, but it was no longer positioned from strength, it came from necessity, and the judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the request without granting control, because the dynamic had changed, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not yet define it, and in the gallery, the same individuals who had exchanged dismissive glances earlier now watched with focused attention, their expressions no longer shaped by assumption, but by curiosity, because something real had entered the room, something that could not be easily categorized or ignored, and Angela remained still, her presence no longer small, no longer overlooked, but steady, grounded, as if she had always belonged in that space even when no one else believed it, and the weight of that realization moved quietly through the room, not announced, not declared, but understood, because respect does not arrive loudly, it settles in after doubt has been proven wrong, and as the judge prepared to speak again, to determine the next step in a process that was no longer predictable, the atmosphere had completely transformed, not through confrontation, not through force, but through clarity, and in that clarity, the roles within the room had shifted in a way that no one could reverse, because once a voice is truly heard, it cannot be unheard, and once the truth has been placed into the record, it does not disappear, it waits, it remains, and it demands to be addressed. The courtroom did not return to its old rhythm, it could not, because something fundamental had shifted, and even the smallest movements now carried a different weight, the shuffle of papers, the quiet clearing of a throat, the subtle turning of heads, all of it sharper, more deliberate, as if everyone understood that what happened next would not follow the usual script, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his hands folded now instead of resting loosely, signaling that this was no longer routine. "We will proceed carefully," he said, his voice steady but firm, and that single sentence redefined the pace of everything that followed, because careful meant deliberate, and deliberate meant that every word, every piece of evidence, every assumption would be examined with a level of scrutiny that had not been present before, and the prosecutor nodded once, a controlled acknowledgement, but the ease he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by calculation, because now he had to respond to something real, something verifiable, something that could not be reshaped through tone or suggestion, and he turned slightly toward Angela, not with the dismissive edge he had shown before, but with a measured distance, as if recognizing that engaging her directly now required precision. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice even, "when exactly was this recording made?" And the question was straightforward, but it carried an undercurrent, an attempt to locate the evidence within a timeline that he could still influence, and Angela answered without hesitation, "This morning, at approximately 8:17 a.m., her voice calm, her words clear, and the specificity landed immediately, because exact time is not something people invent casually, it signals certainty." And the prosecutor paused for a fraction of a second, adjusting, "And you recorded this conversation yourself?" he continued, and Angela nodded, "Yes," and again, no elaboration, no defense, just the truth presented as it was, and the judge observed closely, not just the words, but the way they were delivered, the absence of hesitation, the consistency in tone, because credibility is not only built through evidence, it is revealed through presence. And Angela's presence now carried something that had been overlooked before, not authority in the traditional sense, but clarity, and clarity in a courtroom can outweigh even the most polished argument, and the prosecutor shifted his stance slightly, redirecting his focus. "Your Honor, we would request the opportunity to review the full recording in its entirety and verify its chain of custody," he said, returning to structure, to process, because process was now his strongest ground, and the judge gave a small nod, considering. Because the request was valid, but the context had already altered its impact, this was no longer about whether the recording mattered, it was about how it would be handled, and in the gallery, the earlier tension had transformed into something quieter but more intense, attention sharpened, eyes fixed. Not on appearance, not on assumption, but on detail, because detail had just changed everything, and Angela stood still, not watching the prosecutor, not watching the judge, but simply present, grounded in a moment that no longer required her to prove anything beyond what had already been revealed, and in that stillness, the final remnants of doubt continued to dissolve, because the truth, once introduced, does not argue, it remains, and as the judge prepared to determine the next procedural step, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was no longer a case defined by what was said first, but by what had finally been heard in full. The judge did not rush his next decision, and that restraint carried more authority than any immediate ruling could have, because in a room that had already shifted once, moving too quickly risked losing the clarity that had just been established, and he leaned slightly forward, his gaze steady, not on the prosecutor, not on the jury, but directly at Angela Brooks, as if reassessing not just her statement but her presence within the entire case. "Miss Brooks," he said, his tone measured, deliberate, "prior to today, was this recording disclosed to any party involved in these proceedings?" And the question was precise, not accusatory, but necessary, because process demanded accountability from all sides, and Angela answered without hesitation, "No, Your Honor," her voice calm, her posture unchanged, and that answer introduced a new layer, not of doubt, but of timing, because timing determines impact. And impact, in a courtroom, can alter outcomes as much as facts themselves, and the prosecutor stepped forward again, seizing that opening, his voice regaining a trace of its earlier confidence. "Your Honor, this raises significant concerns regarding procedural fairness," he said, and the argument was valid, structured, an attempt to reclaim ground through rules rather than narrative, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the balance might tilt again, not fully, but enough to complicate what had just been revealed, and the judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, because fairness is not optional, it is foundational. And yet, as he looked down at the phone resting on the bench, the reality of what had been heard remained unchanged, and that was the distinction that now defined the room, not whether the evidence existed, but how it would be weighed against the process that governed its use. And Angela's public defender shifted in his seat, finally stepping into the space he had previously avoided. "Your Honor," he said, his voice more grounded now, more certain, while the timing of disclosure may be unconventional, the content of the recording directly addresses the core issue of this case, and his words did not challenge the rules, they reframed their importance, placing truth alongside procedure rather than beneath it, and that reframing landed, because the judge did not immediately respond. Instead he allowed the silence to stretch again, not uncomfortably, but purposefully, as if giving the weight of both arguments time to settle, and in the gallery, the attention remained fixed, no longer scattered, no longer guided by assumption, because now every word mattered, every shift in tone carried meaning, and Angela stood quietly, not inserting herself into the exchange, not pushing her position, because she did not need to, the evidence had already spoken, and her role now was not to argue, but to remain consistent, to remain grounded in the truth she had introduced. And that consistency continued to build something stronger than any single statement, it built credibility, and credibility, once established, does not fluctuate easily, and the prosecutor, recognizing the shift, adjusted again, his voice steady but more controlled. If the court intends to consider this material, we request a brief recess to review its full contents, he said, and this time the request was not about stopping the momentum, it was about adapting to it, and the judge finally moved, his hand resting lightly on the bench as he considered the path forward, because what had begun as a straightforward proceeding had become something more complex, something that required not just judgment, but balance, and after a moment, he spoke, a brief recess will be granted, and the gavel tapped once, not as a conclusion, but as a transition, and as the room began to shift, chairs moving, quiet voices rising, Angela remained still for just a second longer than everyone else, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, because she understood something that no one had fully acknowledged yet, that the moment of doubt had already passed, and what remained now was not whether she would be heard, but how the truth she had revealed would reshape everything that followed. The courtroom slowly emptied into low, controlled movement as the recess took effect, but the energy did not disperse, it condensed, gathering in quiet conversations, in glances that lasted a second longer than before, in the subtle shift of posture from certainty to reconsideration, and Angela Brooks stepped back from the center of the room, not retreating, but repositioning, as if she understood that the moment had moved beyond confrontation and into consequence, and her public defender turned toward her again, this time without hesitation, his voice steadier. You knew this would change everything, he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Angela met his gaze briefly, her expression calm. I knew it would tell the truth, she replied, and that distinction mattered, because she was not focused on outcome, she was focused on accuracy, and accuracy has a way of reshaping outcomes on its own. And across the room, the prosecutor stood near the bench, reviewing the phone now in his possession, his movements controlled, deliberate, but slower than before, as if each second required more calculation than it had earlier, and the confidence that once defined him had not disappeared, but it had narrowed, becoming something more cautious, more precise, because the margin for error had closed, and one misstep now would not go unnoticed. And in the gallery, the earlier spectators who had once exchanged dismissive looks now leaned forward, their attention fully engaged, because the narrative they had accepted so easily was no longer intact, and once a narrative fractures, people begin to look for what they missed, and what they missed often changes how they see everything that came before. And Angela remained still near her seat, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, not watching the prosecutor, not watching the jury, but simply existing within a moment that no longer required her to defend her presence, because that presence had already been validated, and validation, once earned through truth, does not depend on approval, and the judge, now off the bench but still within view, spoke quietly with the court clerk, his tone measured, his posture reflecting the weight of responsibility that had shifted more heavily onto his shoulders, because what had seemed routine now required careful navigation, and careful navigation demands time, and time changes perception, and as the minutes passed, the room did not return to its previous state, it evolved, becoming more aware, more attentive, more grounded in the details that had once been overlooked, and when the judge finally returned to his seat, the subtle movement drew immediate focus, conversations quieting, bodies settling, attention narrowing once again to the front of the room, and the gavel rested untouched for a moment longer than usual, as if acknowledging that what came next would not be a continuation, but a recalibration, and the prosecutor stepped back into position, composed, but no longer leading, because leadership in that space now depended on alignment with truth rather than control of perception. And Angela took her place once more, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but the way the room saw her had shifted completely, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, because respect does not announce itself, it reveals itself in silence, in attention, in the absence of dismissal, and as the judge prepared to resume proceedings, it became clear that the case was no longer about proving what had already been assumed, it was about understanding what had been overlooked, and that difference would shape everything that followed. When the judge finally resumed the session, the sound of the gavel did not echo with the same finality it once carried, instead it marked a continuation that felt entirely different from what had been interrupted, and the room responded instantly. Conversation ceased, movement stilled, and every eye returned to the bench with a level of attention that had not existed before, because now no one was watching out of habit, they were watching out of need, and the judge's gaze moved deliberately across the room, taking in the prosecutor, the defense, and finally Angela Brooks, as if recalibrating the weight each presence now held in the proceedings. "We will continue with the consideration of newly presented evidence," he said, his voice steady, but the phrasing mattered, because this was no longer about reviewing claims, it was about acknowledging something that had already begun to reshape the case, and the prosecutor stepped forward, composed but measured, his earlier confidence now replaced with a sharper focus. "Your Honor, after reviewing the recording, the prosecution acknowledges that additional context exists beyond what was initially presented." And the admission was subtle, carefully worded, but it landed heavily. Because acknowledgement, even without full concession, signals a shift that cannot be undone, and a quiet murmur rippled through the gallery before quickly settling back into silence, and Angela did not react, did not shift, did not claim the moment, because she did not need to. The room had already moved, and across the aisle, her public defender stood straighter, his presence more defined now, no longer uncertain. "Your Honor, the defense submits that this context directly challenges the interpretation of prior statements and calls into question the reliability of the narrative presented earlier," and his words were no longer tentative, they were aligned, grounded in something real rather than speculative, and the judge listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharper, more deliberate, because now every statement had to align with what had been heard, and anything that did not would stand out immediately, and the prosecutor adjusted his stance. Again, not retreating, but repositioning, the prosecution maintains that while context has expanded, the core elements of the case remain subject to interpretation, he said, and there it was, the last attempt to hold on to flexibility, to preserve space for argument, but the difference now was that interpretation no longer stood alone, it stood beside evidence, and evidence does not bend as easily as words do, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the bench, his voice measured but firm. "Interpretation must follow fact, not precede it," he said, and the clarity of that statement settled over the room like a final adjustment, because it defined the order of importance, and once that order is established, it becomes the framework everything else must fit within, and the prosecutor paused, not for effect, but because there was nothing immediate to counter that without contradicting what had already been acknowledged, and in that pause, the room felt it, the shift from argument to consequence, from assumption to accountability, and Angela remained still, her presence no longer questioned, no longer diminished, but fully integrated into the reality of the case, and for the first time since the proceedings began, the next steps were not about testing her credibility, they were about addressing the implications of what she had revealed, and as the judge prepared to move forward, it became clear that the case had crossed a threshold, one where the outcome would no longer be shaped by perception, but by the truth that had already been placed on record, and in that moment, the silence in the room was not empty, it was resolved, because everyone understood that what came next would not restore what had been, it would define what would remain. The room did not erupt, it did not need to, because the shift had already happened in a quieter, more permanent way, and the judge's words still lingered, defining the structure that now governed everything that followed, and the prosecutor stood there for a moment longer, not frozen, but recalibrating, because once the foundation changes, every argument built on it must adjust or collapse, and he knew that continuing as if nothing had shifted would only expose the gap between what was said and what was now known, so instead, he chose his next words with precision. "Your Honor, in light of the full context, the Prosecution acknowledges that the prior characterization of Miss Brooks' statement may have been incomplete, and the phrasing was careful, controlled, but it carried the weight of concession without surrender, and that distinction mattered, because in a courtroom, language is not just communication, it is positioning, and the judge listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but absorbing the adjustment for what it was. A recognition that the narrative had changed, and across the room. Angela Brooks remained still, her presence unchanged, because she was not waiting for validation, she was witnessing alignment, and alignment, once it begins, does not reverse easily, and her public defender stepped forward again, his voice now steady with a confidence that had been absent before. Your Honor, the defense submits that this acknowledgement confirms what has been evident since the full recording was introduced, that the original interpretation lacked essential context and therefore cannot stand as the basis for judgment, and his words were no longer tentative, they were anchored, supported by what had already been established, and the judge nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as recognition of structure, because structure is what allows decisions to hold, and without it, even the most confident ruling can unravel, and the prosecutor did not immediately respond, not because he could not, but because the moment required something different, something measured. And instead of pressing forward, he took a small step back, physically and strategically, allowing the weight of what had been said to settle fully in the room, and that step back, subtle as it was, spoke louder than any argument he could have made, because it signaled that the position he once held no longer occupied the same ground, and in the gallery, the shift was undeniable, the earlier certainty replaced by a quiet, attentive stillness, not driven by curiosity anymore, but by understanding. Because people no longer needed to guess what was happening, they were watching it unfold clearly, and Angela's voice, the very thing that had been dismissed at the beginning, now existed in the room not as something to be judged, but as something that had revealed truth, and that transformation carried a weight no argument could override, and the judge finally leaned forward again, his hands resting firmly on the bench, his voice calm but definitive. The court will proceed with the understanding that the previously presented interpretation is no longer sufficient in light of the complete record, he said. And the statement did not raise its tone, it did not emphasize, it simply established, and establishment is what gives decisions their permanence, and as those words settled into the room, the structure of the case shifted fully into place, no longer built on assumption, no longer guided by incomplete information, but grounded in what had actually been said, actually heard, and actually understood, and Angela stood quietly within that moment, not elevated, not celebrated, but recognized. And that recognition, earned through patience, through clarity, through truth, carried more power than anything that had been said about her before, because in the end, it was not the loudest voice that shaped the outcome, it was the one that remained steady long enough to be heard in full. The judge allowed the silence to settle fully before speaking again, not as a delay, but as acknowledgement, because what had unfolded in that room was not just a shift in evidence, it was a correction in understanding, and those corrections demand space, and when he finally leaned forward, his voice carried a clarity that did not need emphasis. This court will not proceed on an incomplete narrative, he said. And the words landed with quiet finality, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, and in that moment, the direction of the case was no longer uncertain, it was defined. And the prosecutor lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there are moments in a courtroom where the argument ends before the verdict is spoken, and this was one of them, and Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting reaction, because she had not come to prove something louder than others, she had come to ensure that what was true was heard in full, and now it had been, and her public defender exhaled slowly, a subtle release of tension that had been building since the beginning, because what once seemed uncertain had resolved itself not through strategy, but through patience, and the judge continued, his tone steady, based on the complete record now before the court. Prior assumptions regarding the reliability of Miss Brooks' statement are no longer supported, and with that, the final barrier that had framed her presence in the room dissolved, not dramatically, but completely, and in the gallery, no one spoke, no one reacted outwardly, because the weight of the moment did not invite noise, it invited reflection, and reflection carries its own kind of silence, the kind that lingers long after words are finished, and the judge reached for the gavel once more, not to interrupt, not to pause, but to conclude. And when it struck the wood, the sound echoed differently than it had at the beginning, because this time it did not signal control, it signaled resolution.